Next, Russia declares a state of emergency in its Kursk region on day 3 of a Ukrainian incursion. The story coming through via the filter of the Kremlin has it that Vladimir Putin, the man who launched, of course, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 and who has maintained air and missile strikes ever since, as well as trench warfare in the eastern Donbass, Putin is denouncing a major provocation. Brian Quinn has this.
According to the Kremlin, the highlighted areas in these images indicate Ukrainian army positions within the southwest Russian region of Kursk before they're hit with artillery. This Russian military handout claims to show a helicopter attacking yet more Ukrainian forces in Kursk. In a video meeting with President Vladimir Putin, Russia's top general vowed to crush what appears to be a major raid by Ukrainian troops into Russian territory.
Airstrikes, missile forces, and artillery fire stopped the enemy's advance inland into Russian territory towards Kursk.
Putin called it a large-scale provocation as he convened a number of emergency government meetings. Though it's not Ukraine's first military operation inside Russia, the incursion marks the first time regular Ukrainian army troops have taken part. Moscow says up to 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers, along with dozens of tanks and armored vehicles, crossed the border north of the Ukrainian town of Sumy, with one line of attack making significant headway towards the Russian town of Sudzha. Kremlin sources say Ukrainian shelling has killed several civilians in Sudzha and forced thousands more to evacuate. Kyiv has yet to comment on the situation beyond a subtle reference from President Volodymyr Zelensky on Wednesday.
The more pressure exerted on Russia, on the aggressor that brought the war to Ukraine, the closer peace will be. Just peace through just force.
Analysts have questioned the wisdom of such an operation at a moment when Ukrainian troops are already overstretched and outgunned along the lines of Russia's invasion inside their own territory. Washington, Kyiv's top military and financial backer, says it is seeking clarification from Ukrainian leaders about their objectives.
Brian Quinn with that report. Let's get the analysis. Frank Ledwidge is standing by, former UK military intelligence officer and senior lecturer in strategy at Portsmouth University. Frank, always a pleasure to have you on France 24. We need your clarity on this situation. How do you read it?
Well, good evening, Mark. It's quite significant, of course. This is the first time that Ukrainian military, as opposed to Russian dissidents, have entered Russia, invaded Russia effectively. But then the mystery remains, well, what's the purpose of this? And I think there are 3 broad reasons put forward by analysts. The first is that this is to provide leverage in terms of land, to get some land, to catch some land, to exchange that further, effectively exchange it further along the line, particularly in November when Zelensky is planning a peace conference to which Russia should be invited. That's a possibility. The second, and attached to that, is to demonstrate the capability to do that at a time when, as your report said, they're under really, really firm pressure in the south. Second reason is that this is some diversion in order to pull forces away from the south and east. I don't think that's a runner at all. The Russians have plenty in terms of numbers and equipment. And the third, and I think the most credible reason, is that this was a preemptive assault to preempt a potential attack by Russian forces into Sumy itself. We've had some hints about that, and to disrupt what would have been a very damaging operation on the part of Russia. In other words, to get the jump on them. I think that's the most likely, but who knows? The answer is nobody, not even apparently the Americans.
That is interesting because it has been said in certain quarters the Americans didn't know about this. What is that telling us about Kyiv-Washington relations?
Well, if they didn't know that, it's A, surprising, and B, for the Americans at least, and indeed the rest of the West, it's not a good message. I think in an alliance like this, where Ukraine is essentially, it's wholly supported, armed, financed, and provided with intelligence information, there has to be a high level of mutual trust. If the Ukrainians are conducting a major and highly politically sensitive operation into Russia without telling their allies, I don't know whether that's the case, but if it is, it's a bad message, and it shows, I think, a lack of that mutual understanding that's essential amongst allies. But like I say, we don't really know who knew what. If they did do that without Western support, what they will have done, of course, is use Western-supplied intelligence as well as the Western-supplied kit that we see in plenty in Russia at the moment. So I suspect the Americans knew no more than they're saying, but we just don't know.
Vladimir Putin clearly declaring an emergency in Kursk. This is telling us something about how seriously Russia is taking the situation. Do you think in some way this has exposed certain weaknesses in Russia's planning?
Absolutely. It's extremely embarrassing. The Ukrainians have done to the Russians once again what they did nearly 2 years ago in the Kharkiv region when they found a lightly defended border. That doesn't mean, by the way, there are no Russian troops well behind that border. If they were planning an assault on Sumy, those troops will not have been on the border. But nonetheless, they found a lightly defended part of the border. They swept through and exploited that weakness. However, whatever the reason for the attack, what's going to happen now very clearly is that Russia will begin counterattacking, either with the forces they have in place, perhaps 100 or so kilometres back. Those will start arriving pretty soon, or with units that will be brought in to engage the Ukrainians, who are right as we speak, still making some progress, but I think some of them beginning to dig in expectation of that counterattack.
Still making progress. Putin, we always hear, has the numbers, has the troops, but is it likely he'll call on some of his axis to provide some hardware, some personnel? I'm talking North Korea, Iran, and obviously the Central Asian mercenaries that can be called upon.
I don't think no more than that's been happening already. I mean, there's supposed to be a North Korean brigade of engineers in the south already, or at least I think they're probably being deployed around now. They were announced 2 or 3 months ago. They're getting plenty of ammunition off the North Koreans, at least, and the Iranian and other so-called allies, particularly North Korea. No, they won't need manpower. They have plenty of manpower, and at the moment, plenty of equipment, as General Syrski said 2 weeks ago. So the key issue here is the speed with which Ukrainians were able to advance, and the strategic surprise that they've demonstrated.
So Ukraine making this swoop preemptive, it could be, as you're saying, Frank, and that does make sense, doesn't it, completely? Washington in the dark or not, we don't really know, do we? It's one of those things. But clearly what is happening in the US now politically must be weighing on Volodymyr Zelensky's mind.
Absolutely. It's not simply the fear, and I think it is fear that Trump might be elected, but there's the awareness, I think, that there's a certain ennui creeping into the United States with respect to this war, especially, of course, against the background of what seems to be an increasingly likely escalation, at least in the Middle East. And what the Americans don't want, they don't want either of these conflicts, frankly. Their priority, certainly the military priority of the US military, is nowhere near that. It's in the Western Pacific. So I think not only amongst the sort of electorate of the United States, but also I think amongst its administration, its military, they want to get both of these wars dealt with. That's to say, the Middle East and Ukraine at that strategic level. And I think Zelensky is aware of that. And what they're trying to do is get as much advantage as they possibly can. Of course, one thing we haven't really discussed yet is the situation in the south, which for Ukraine, it's not critical, but it's very, very shaky. It's very poor there in the south. They're losing land every day. And that's the center of gravity here. That's the real fight down there. Anything else is essentially almost a distraction from the main effort and that main center of gravity, which is manpower and attritional warfare.
That was going to be my next question about the South, Frank. You've gone there already, so please tell us more.
Well, over the last couple of weeks, particularly, Ukrainians have come under pressure in the area of Pokrovsk, where the Russians have been making incremental but considerable progress. Now, we're not talking about kilometres a day, although 1 or 2 days there were kilometres advances, but it's an incremental advance, a couple 100 metres now, a part of a village there. They'll take a small settlement. But the important thing is they're starting to break through Ukrainian defences down on that southern front in Donetsk, not too far. Well, I say not too far. It's 30 kilometres or so from Avdiivka, but much more importantly, 10 kilometres, 15 kilometres from Pokrovsk. So we'll look out for that name over the next few weeks as the Russians creep closer and perhaps enter that over the next, in the medium term. But also in the north, Chasiv Yar we've not heard about for a long time, but the Russians are creeping and making progress up there in the north as well, and Kupiansk too. And these have been names on our lips now for the last 6 months or so, and they will continue to be. And sadly for the Ukrainians, they are being pushed back. I don't foresee any breakthrough. The Russians aren't capable of that, but there's this steady incremental advance in this attritional fight, a bit like the First World War, attritional fight in the south, which is where the main fighting is taking place.
Frank Ledwidge, Former UK military intelligence officer and lecturer, senior lecturer in strategy at Portsmouth University. It's always enlightening when you join us, and thank you for the clarity you brought to what is an increasingly complex situation with Ukraine pushing into that Russian Kursk region. Frank Ledwidge, thank you for joining us here on France 24.
Thank you, Mark. Pleasure.
We continue to watch, of course, for all developments on the situation in Ukraine.